She stood in the center of Ridgeline Galleria, with 4 shopping bags pulling at her wrists, and looked straight through him like he was part of the tile. The man in the gray maintenance uniform had been mopping the floor near the south fountain when she stopped, tilted her chin, and said it plainly. "Carry my bags to the valet. I will tip you $1. He did not answer immediately. He set the mop handle against the cart, looked at her once, and said nothing. Inside the pocket of the jacket hanging from that cart was an envelope bearing the raised seal of Morrison & Whitfield LLP, and inside that envelope was a signed purchase agreement for the building she was standing in, $220 million, his name on the last page. But the man she just ordered around like hired help had signed the deed to every square foot she was standing on, and when that truth surfaced, nothing inside this building would stay the same. Have you ever watched someone talk down to the wrong person in public and just waited for the moment it all flipped? 4 years before that afternoon, Garrett Hollis had stood in a cemetery outside Hartford, Connecticut, holding a boy who was too young to understand why his mother was not coming home. Abigail had been driving back from a client dinner on Route 9 when a delivery truck crossed the median. The hospital called at 11:14 at night. Garrett was asleep with Nolan curled against his chest, and when the phone rang, some part of him already knew. He did not scream. He did not throw anything. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, and then he picked up his son and held him until the sun came up. In the weeks that followed, Garrett made decisions that no one in his circle understood. He stepped away from the executive board of Sinclair Holdings, the private commercial real estate empire his family had built over 3 generations. He transferred operational authority to a managing director he trusted, took his son, and disappeared. He changed his last name back to his mother's maiden name, Hollis. He moved to Scottsdale, Arizona, rented a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, and applied for a maintenance position at a shopping mall called Ridgeline Galleria. He told no one, not the board, not his attorney, not the woman who had been Abigail's closest friend. He packed 2 suitcases, put his son in a car seat, and drove west until the landscape turned dry and the sky opened up in a way that made everything behind him feel like it had happened to someone else. Mornings in that apartment followed a rhythm that never changed. Garrett woke at 5:30, made scrambled eggs and toast for Nolan, packed a lunch with a note folded inside the bag, and drove his son to Mesquite Elementary before clocking in at 7. Nolan was 8 now, quiet like his father, with the same habit of watching people before speaking to them. He liked to draw. Most of his pictures were of buildings, tall ones with too many windows, and lately he had started drawing the same image over and over, 2 stick figures standing in front of a large rectangle with a triangular roof. He taped the newest version to the refrigerator the morning everything started, and Garrett paused with his coffee in hand and looked at it for a long time. At Ridgeline Galleria, Garrett was known as G. He fixed leaking pipes, replaced lighting panels, recalibrated escalator sensors, and checked the HVAC system every Tuesday and Friday. He wore the same gray uniform as every other member of the maintenance crew and carried a ring of keys that jangled when he walked. No one asked where he had come from, and he never volunteered. The only person who seemed to notice anything unusual was Ruth Cabrera, the 56-year-old operations manager who had been running the building's day-to-day logistics for over a decade. Ruth had once watched Garrett diagnose a faulty compressor relay in under 90 seconds, a task that typically required a licensed technician and a diagnostic kit. She had asked him, "Where did you learn all this?" He had looked at her without expression and said, "I read a lot." She had not asked again, but she had not stopped watching either. The mall itself was in transition. Creston Property Group, the firm that had owned and managed Ridgeline Galleria for the past 12 years, had recently sold the property to an unnamed buyer. The deal had closed quietly, processed through a series of holding entities, and nobody on the ground floor knew who the new owner was. All they knew was that a 90-day transition period had begun, and during that window, where operational authority still rested with Creston's leadership team, specifically with a man named Derek Voss. Derek was 44, sharp-jawed, expensive-suited, and possessed the particular kind of confidence that came from never having been seriously challenged. As Creston's chief operating officer, he controlled the budgets, the vendor contracts, and the security protocols. He walked through the mall like it still belonged to him. In a sense, for the next 90 days it did. He referred to the maintenance staff as replaceable. He had said that word in front of Garrett once, during a hallway inspection, without looking at him. Garrett had continued tightening a light fixture and had not responded, but Ruth had noticed something. In the past 60 days, 3 new maintenance contracts had been signed, each one with a company she had never heard of, each one priced well above market rate. She had pulled the paperwork and found inconsistencies, overlapping service dates, duplicate billing codes. She brought the file to Garrett one afternoon in the break room, not because she thought he could do anything about it, but because he was the only person in the building she trusted enough to say it out loud. "Something is off with the maintenance contracts," she told him. "The numbers do not add up." Garrett took the file, opened it, turned 2 pages, and his eyes changed. It was subtle and narrowing, a stillness, but it was there. He closed the file and said, "I will take a look." Marin Ashford's world operated at a different altitude. At 34, she was the chief executive officer of Ashford Luxe, a high-end fashion brand with flagship locations in 11 cities across the United States. The Scottsdale store, occupying the largest ground-floor suite in Ridgeline Galleria, had been her first major opening as CEO. It was the store that proved her vision, the one she had fought the board to fund, and now it was the one they wanted to shut down. The numbers were not kind. Revenue had declined for 3 consecutive quarters. Foot traffic in the Scottsdale market had softened. The board of directors had begun circling the location with red ink, and during a particularly tense video conference on a Wednesday afternoon, the chairman had said it bluntly: "Either Scottsdale justifies its overhead by the end of the fiscal quarter, or we close it." Marin had ended the call, closed her laptop, and stared at the wall of her office for 6 minutes without moving. She was standing outside her store later that afternoon when Derek Voss appeared with an invitation to lunch. They had a professional relationship built on mutual convenience. Derek had helped negotiate her lease terms when she first moved in, and Marin considered him a useful ally in a building full of strangers. Over salads in the mezzanine cafe, Derek leaned forward and lowered his voice. "I have influence with the transition team," he told her. "I can make sure Ashford Luxe keeps its position when the new ownership takes over." Marin studied him. She was sharp enough to hear the offer beneath the offer, but desperate enough to consider it. She thanked him and said she would be in touch. What she did not know was that Derek needed her as much as she needed him. The flagship Ashford Luxe store anchored the ground floor's valuation. If it stayed, the leasable square footage around it stayed premium priced, and Derek was quietly transferring management rights for that square footage to a shell company he controlled. He needed Marin's store to remain as a prop in a stage he was building for himself. Across the mezzanine, Garrett was replacing a row of recessed lights near the railing. Derek walked past him on the way out, nearly kicking the toolbox on the floor, and said over his shoulder to Marin without slowing down, "They really need to keep the maintenance crew out of sight during business hours." Marin glanced at Garrett. She did not disagree. She did not say anything at all. She simply looked away. Garrett watched them leave. Then he returned to the maintenance office, closed the door, and opened a personal laptop he kept locked inside the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet. He logged into the internal management portal of Sinclair Holdings, using an administrator account. He pulled up a list of every vendor contract signed during the transition period, scrolled through them slowly, and stopped on one line. He stared at it for 30 seconds. Then he took a screenshot and attached it to an encrypted email and sent it to his personal attorney with a subject line that read, "Flag this, do not move yet." The humiliation happened on a Thursday afternoon, at the peak of the rush, in the wide-open atrium of the ground floor where the sound carried. Marin had just finished a promotional photo shoot inside the flagship. She walked out into the atrium trailed by 2 assistants, her heels clicking on the polished stone, 4 bags of sample inventory hanging from both hands. She was irritated. The shoot had run long. The board had sent another email she had not opened, and the bags were heavier than they should have been. Garrett was pushing his maintenance cart past the south corridor when Marin spotted him. She called out without looking directly at his face, "Hey, you work here, right? Carry these to my car at valet. I will tip you $1. There were perhaps 20 people within earshot. A mother with a stroller, 2 teenage employees from the sneaker store, a couple sitting on the bench near the fountain, an older man reading a newspaper. Garrett stopped the cart. He looked at her. He did not raise his voice. "I am maintenance," he said, "not valet." Marin let out a short laugh. the kind that was not really a laugh but a sound designed to make someone feel small. She looked around the atrium as though inviting the audience to agree with her. "Same uniform, same paycheck," she said. "What is the difference?" One of her assistants laughed. A sales associate from the jewelry store nearby lowered her eyes and turned away. Derek Voss, who happened to be crossing the atrium at that moment, stopped, took in the scene, and smiled. He placed a hand on Garrett's shoulder, casual, possessive, and said, "Come on, G, help the lady out. That is what you are here for." Garrett did not remove Derek's hand. He simply stepped forward, lifted the 4 bags from the bench where Marin had set them, placed them neatly on the nearest chair, and said, "Your bags are safe. Have a good afternoon." Then he returned to his cart, and pushed it down the corridor without looking back. Marin stood in the atrium holding nothing. No one moved to help. The silence lasted 4 full seconds before her assistant finally picked up the bags, and by then the damage was done not to Garrett, but to Marin, because the man she had dismissed had refused her without anger, without humiliation in return, without the slightest crack in his composure, and that kind of refusal left a mark that no apology could undo, until she understood what she had refused to see. Ruth Cabrera watched the entire exchange from behind the customer service desk. After Garrett disappeared down the corridor, she walked to the spot where he had been standing and noticed a small piece of paper on the floor, torn from the corner of a document, likely fallen from the jacket on his cart. She picked it up. In the upper left corner was a logo she recognized. Sinclair Holdings. Beneath it, a partial line of text. Transfer of ownership Ridgeline Galleria. Ruth stood very still. Then she folded the paper and put it in her pocket. The HVAC failure happened that same evening, at 9:17, when the central cooling system for the ground floor shut down without warning. Within 20 minutes, the temperature inside the atrium had climbed past 100 degrees. 14 stores were still open for a late-night promotional event, and customers were already leaving. Derek made one phone call. The company he contacted, Pinnacle Mechanical Services, quoted 48 hours for a diagnostic and $95,000 to replace the central control module. Derek approved it on the spot. Ruth called Garrett. He arrived in 20 minutes, wearing a clean shirt and carrying a canvas tool bag. He did not rush. He walked with the kind of unhurried precision that Ruth had come to associate with him, the gait of a man who already knew what he would find before he opened the panel. He accessed the main HVAC control unit on the service level, spent 4 minutes running diagnostics through the interface terminal, and identified the problem. It was not hardware. The firmware controlling the temperature regulation system had been corrupted by a botched remote update or what appeared to be one. The corruption was targeted, affecting only the cooling cycle subroutines while leaving the heating elements untouched. Garrett connected his laptop to the panel, reflashed the firmware from a backup image he kept on an encrypted drive, recalibrated the thermal sensors one by one, and brought the system back online in 47 minutes. The cost was zero. When the cool air began flowing again, the employees in the nearby stores broke into applause. Garrett nodded once, packed his tools, and said nothing. Marin was in the building. She had been checking inventory in the stockroom when the system went down, and had come out to the atrium when she felt the heat. She stood near the fountain and watched Garrett work, watched him open the panel with the certainty of someone who had done it 1,000 times, watched his hands move without hesitation, watched him type commands into a laptop that no maintenance worker should have owned. When the air came back on and the applause broke out, she did not clap. She crossed her arms and stared at him with an expression that was no longer contempt. It was something closer to suspicion. What kind of maintenance man reflashes firmware, she thought, and she did not have an answer. Derek arrived late, after the system was already running. He looked surprised and then annoyed. He pulled Garrett aside. "Who authorized you to touch the central system?" Garrett looked at him evenly. "The temperature was 101 degrees, he said. "That is authorization enough." Derek turned to Ruth. "Next time, go through my office first. That is protocol." Ruth looked at him without expression and said nothing. Later that night, alone in the maintenance office, Garrett opened the HVAC system log on his laptop. He traced the firmware corruption to its source. It had not been an accidental update failure. The code had been injected remotely, deliberately, from an IP address that resolved to the building's administrative network. Specifically, to the terminal in Derek Voss's office. Garrett saved the log, encrypted it, and added it to a growing folder on his desktop labeled with a single word: evidence. 2 days later, at 7:43 in the morning, before the first stores had opened and while the cleaning crew was still buffing the atrium floors, the sprinkler system on the second floor activated. There was no fire. There was no smoke. There was no alarm trigger in the system log. There was only water, thousands of gallons of it cascading from the ceiling onto 3 retail suites, soaking through drywall, flooding display cases, and pooling in rivers across the carpeted floors. The secondary storage room for Ashford Lux took the worst of it. By the time the system was manually shut down, the damage was catastrophic. $400,000 in sample garments, imported fabrics, and couture prototypes had been soaked beyond recovery. Silk that had been shipped from Milan, wool blends sourced from a single supplier in Scotland. Prototypes for the fall collection that existed nowhere else. Marin arrived within the hour, walked into the storage room, and stood in the middle of the ruined inventory without speaking. Water dripped from the racks in a slow, steady cadence. The carpet squelched under her heels. Her assistant stood in the doorway with a clipboard, unable to make eye contact. A rack of evening gowns sagged under the weight of the water, the fabric darkened and misshapen beyond any possibility of restoration. This was the blow that would end everything. The board would not overlook this. The insurance claim alone would take months, and in the meantime, the Scottsdale flagship would hemorrhage credibility. Marin could feel the position she had fought to build cracking beneath her feet. Derek appeared within the hour, voice pitched with practiced sympathy. He offered to handle the insurance process personally, said he had a preferred damage assessor, a firm called Alliance Appraisal Group. He put his hand on Marin's arm and told her not to worry. "I will take care of this," he said. "You focus on your brand." Garrett was already on the second floor. He had accessed the mechanical room adjacent to the affected section and was examining the valve cluster that controlled the sprinkler zone. It took him less than 5 minutes to confirm what he suspected. The zone isolation valve, a manual lever that required deliberate physical force to turn, had been opened by hand. The position indicator was rotated 90 degrees. This was not a system malfunction. This was sabotage. He photographed the valve from 3 angles, recorded the position indicator reading, and logged the timestamp. Then he called Ruth. She arrived, looked at the evidence, and said they should call the police immediately. Garrett shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "We report now. He covers his tracks. I need the full picture." Marin appeared behind them while Garrett was still crouching near the valve. Her voice was cold. "Are you documenting this to cover yourself? Because if maintenance failed, it is on your department." Garrett stood and faced her. He did not flinch. "This valve was opened by hand," he said. "Your inventory was not destroyed by accident." Marin stopped. For the first time since she had met him, she looked directly into his eyes, not down at him, not through him, but at him. She did not reply, but she did not walk away either. Garrett left the mechanical room and called his attorney from the stairwell. "Move the timeline up," he said. "I need a full forensic audit on every contract Voss signed in the last 90 days. And pull the security camera logs for Sector 7, Tuesday night between 11 and 2 in the morning." Ruth caught him at the bottom of the stairs. "Who are you, Garrett?" He stopped walking. He did not turn around. "Someone who should have stepped in sooner," he said. Then he pushed through the door and was gone. The next morning, a formal letter arrived at Creston Property Group's regional office from the legal counsel of Sinclair Holdings. The letter demanded an immediate freeze on all new vendor contracts during the transition period, citing a routine compliance review. The language was polite. The implication was not. Derek read the letter twice. He had 3 contracts sitting on his desk, waiting for signatures, worth a combined $2.1 million. All 3 were with companies he owned through intermediaries. If those contracts were frozen, the money was gone. He called his attorney. He called the transition liaison at Sinclair Holdings. He got voicemail both times. Meanwhile, Marin received a call from her board chairman. The insurance claim for the sprinkler damage had been flagged. The board wanted a full accounting within 5 business days. If the Scottsdale location could not demonstrate operational viability and a path to recovery, they would vote to close it. 5 days. Marin needed data: the insurance documentation, the building's incident report, the maintenance records, The original lease amendment that specified liability thresholds. Without those documents, she could not build the case that the damage was not her fault and that the location remained viable. She went to Derek's office to request them. He was on the phone when she entered, and he held up one finger without looking at her. When he finished the call, he leaned back in his chair and smiled the way he always did, the kind of smile that offered warmth without providing heat. "I will handle the paperwork," he said. "You focus on your brand." It was the second time he had said those exact words, and this time Marin heard something in them she had missed before. Not reassurance. Control. A gate disguised as a hand. She went to the operations office instead. Ruth was there, standing near a desk covered in folders. On the corner of that desk, left in plain view as though someone had forgotten it, was a technical report. 4 pages, typed with photographs. The report detailed the sprinkler failure on the second floor and concluded, in clear language, that the zone isolation valve had been manually opened. It was not a system error. The report included time-stamped photographs of the valve position and a comparison to factory settings. Marin picked it up. "Who wrote this?" she asked. Ruth looked at her steadily. "The same man you tried to tip $1, she said. Marin read the report twice. Then she set it down and left without another word. Her hands were not steady. That afternoon, Garrett picked Nolan up from school. The boy ran across the pickup lane with his backpack bouncing and climbed into the truck. He was smiling. "Dad, are you going to fix the big building?" he asked. Garrett buckled him in and kissed the top of his head. "I am trying, buddy," he said. Nolan pulled a folded piece of paper from his backpack, another drawing of the 2 stick figures and the building, this time with a bright yellow sun above it. Garrett held it for a moment, then placed it carefully on the dashboard. Derek received the results of the background check at 8:45 that evening. He had hired a private investigator through a contact in Phoenix, paid in cash at a diner off the interstate, and asked for a full history on Garrett Hollis of Scottsdale, Arizona. What came back was almost nothing. No employment history prior to 4 years ago. No educational records on file. No credit history before 22. No social media presence. No property records. No tax filings under that name before his arrival in Arizona. No digital footprint of any kind before the year Garrett appeared in Scottsdale. It was as though the man had been manufactured. A name attached to a body with no past behind it. The investigator had included one additional finding, flagged with a yellow tab, a photograph pulled from an archived business journal article published 6 years earlier, accompanying a profile of Sinclair Holdings and its multi-generational leadership structure. The headline read, "Sinclair Holdings Names Next Generation Leadership." In the photograph, a younger man stood beside the chairman of the board at a corporate gala in a ballroom in Manhattan. The face was leaner, the hair shorter, the suit worth more than a year of maintenance wages. But the jawline was the same, the posture was the same, and the eyes, steady, watchful, set slightly deep beneath the brow, were unmistakable. Derek stared at the photograph. Then he stared at the ceiling. Then he said a word that he had never said in a boardroom. The timing was now a vice. If Garrett Hollis was Garrett Sinclair, then Derek had been committing fraud directly under the nose of the man who owned the building. Every doctored contract, every shell company invoice, every manipulated system failure had been observed from the inside. That same night, Marin sat alone in her office, the technical report still open on her desk. She had been thinking about it for hours, not the content, but the man who had written it. She opened her laptop, pulled up the insurance documents Derek had sent her 2 days earlier, and began reading them line by line. On the 3rd page, she found the name of the damage assessment firm, Alliance Appraisal Group. She searched the state's business registration database. Alliance Appraisal Group was registered at the same address as Pinnacle Mechanical Services, the company Derek had called for the HVAC repair. Same address. Same registered agent. Marin closed the laptop slowly. The next morning, she went to the maintenance office. Garrett was sitting alone at the workbench, studying what appeared to be a large technical drawing. It was not a wiring diagram or a plumbing schematic. It was the original architectural blueprint of Ridgeline Galleria, the master plan, the kind of document that was stored in ownership archives, not maintenance closets. Marin stood in the doorway. "Why does a maintenance man have the original blueprints of a $220 million property?" she said. Garrett looked up at her. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds without blinking. "Because I need to know what I am protecting," he said. Marin waited for more. Nothing came. She turned and walked out of the room. Her fingers were trembling against the doorframe, and she pressed them flat to stop the shaking. She did not know who Garrett Hollis was, but she knew, with a certainty that settled in her chest like a stone, that he was not what he appeared to be. Back in her office, she opened a browser and typed Sinclair Holdings CEO. The corporate website was minimal. Private family-owned corporation. No public leadership listed. No photographs. No press releases. She stared at the screen, then turned her chair to face the window. From the 3rd floor, she could see the edge of the maintenance corridor below. Derek called an emergency meeting the following day. All tenants were summoned to the 3rd floor conference hall, roughly 40 business owners, store managers, and their assistants, packed into rows of folding chairs under fluorescent lights. Derek stood at the front of the room, with a projected slide behind him, and a confident smile on his face. "The new ownership," he announced, "has requested a 35% increase in lease rates across all ground floor and second floor units, effective upon completion of the transition. In addition, 12 retail spaces will be eliminated as part of a restructuring plan." He paused, letting the words land. Murmurs broke out. A woman in the 2nd row covered her mouth. A man near the back stood up and demanded to see documentation. Derek waved him off. "It is in the transition documents. I have authority to communicate this on behalf of the ownership group." None of it was true. There was no lease increase. There was no restructuring plan. Derek was manufacturing chaos, a smokescreen, to justify his accelerated withdrawal from the property before the new owner formally took control. If every tenant panicked and broke their leases early, the transition would be disrupted. The incoming ownership would inherit a half-empty building, and Derek would be long gone with the money he had siphoned. Marin stood up. She demanded to see the official written notice from the new ownership. She demanded a direct communions had his head. "All communications go through me," he said. "I am your only bridge to the new owner." In the back of the room, a man in a gray maintenance uniform had entered quietly, carrying a mop. He had told the security guard at the door that he was there to check the overhead lighting panel, and the guard had waved him through without a second glance, because that was what people did with maintenance workers. They let them pass, and then forgot they existed. No one in the rows of chairs turned to look at him. No one ever did. He was furniture. He was background. He was the man who fixed things after hours and disappeared before anyone could remember his face. He leaned the mop against the wall and stood in the last row, arms folded, watching. His breathing was even. His expression revealed nothing. Marin saw him. Her eyes moved from Derek to Garrett and back again. Garrett caught her glance. He gave the smallest nod, so small that anyone watching would have missed it. But she did not miss it. Derek continued, "If you want to negotiate, come to me. I am your only bridge to the new owner." He said it again, the word bridge, as though repetition made it true. Garrett set the mop down. He stepped out of the back row and walked forward, past the seated tenants, past the aisle, past the murmuring voices, until he was standing 8 feet from Derek Voss. The room went quiet, not because anyone understood what was happening, but because the maintenance man had walked to the front of a meeting he had not been invited to, and something in the way he moved made it impossible to look away. Derek stared at him. "What are you doing up here?" he said. "This is a tenant meeting." Garrett did not raise his voice. He spoke the way a man speaks when he knows exactly what every word is worth. "There is no rent increase," he said. "There is no cut list, and there is no bridge because the owner is already in the room." 40 people stopped breathing. Derek's face drained of color so quickly it was visible under the fluorescent lights. Marin stood frozen, her lips parted, her hand still resting on the back of the chair in front of her. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence pressed against the walls like a held breath. Derek was the first to break it. "That is absurd," he said. His voice had climbed half an octave. "You are a janitor. Someone call security." He looked around the room. No one reached for a phone. Garrett took out his cell phone, dialed a number, and said 2 words. "Send everything." Within 5 minutes, the double doors of the conference hall opened, and 3 attorneys from Morrison and Whitfield LLP entered in dark suits, carrying matching leather portfolios. The lead attorney stepped forward, identified himself, and addressed the room in a calm, practiced voice. He confirmed that the man standing at the front of the room was Garrett James Sinclair, sole owner and chief executive officer of Sinclair Holdings. He confirmed that Sinclair Holdings had completed the acquisition of Ridgeline Galleria for $220 million, and he confirmed that no lease increases, no tenant reductions, and no restructuring plans had been authorized or communicated by the ownership group. The projection screen behind Derek flickered and changed. The attorneys had connected a laptop. What appeared on the screen was not a slide. It was evidence. The first document was the purchase agreement, Garrett's full legal signature on the closing page, notarized, dated, and countersigned by a representative of Creston Property Group. The second was a ledger of 7 vendor contracts signed by Derek Voss during the transition period, each one awarded to companies registered under entities he controlled through a layered corporate structure. Total value, $3.4 million. The third was the HVAC system log showing firmware tampering originating from an IP address traced to Derek's office terminal, time-stamped on the evening of the failure, 3 hours before the cooling system went down. The fourth was security camera footage from Sector 7, grainy but unmistakable, showing a man in a Creston Property uniform walking to the second-floor mechanical room, opening the sprinkler zone isolation valve at 1:17 in the morning, and then making a phone call from the same hallway to a number registered to Derek's personal cellular account. The fifth was the insurance appraisal filed by Alliance Appraisal Group, whose business registration, physical address, and registered agent were identical to those of Pinnacle Mechanical Services, the company Derek had called for the HVAC repair. Both companies shared the same mailbox at a strip mall office suite in Tempe, Arizona. Derek stood up. "This is fabricated," he started. Garrett cut him off. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. 14 contracts, 3 shell companies, 1 sabotaged sprinkler system that destroyed $400,000 in a woman's inventory to fund your exit. Every byte is logged. Every dollar is traced. And the FBI Financial Crimes Division received this file 40 minutes ago. The room was so silent that the hum of the air conditioning was audible for the first time. Derek looked around the room one more time. No one met his eyes. He picked up his briefcase, walked to the door, and left. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded, in that silence, like a verdict. Derek Voss was arrested 72 hours later on 14 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and intentional property destruction. The tenants in the room sat still for a long moment. Then, slowly, beginning in the back row and moving forward like a wave, they began to clap, not enthusiastically, not with joy, with relief, the kind of applause that comes when something heavy has been lifted and you can finally exhale. Marin did not clap. She stood in the third row and looked at Garrett, the man in the gray uniform, the man she had dismissed in the atrium, the man she had tried to tip a single dollar for carrying her bags. He looked back at her. Neither of them spoke. Then Garrett turned and walked out of the conference hall. Marin followed him into the hallway on the 3rd floor, where the noise from the conference room faded behind the heavy doors and the corridor stretched long and quiet under a row of ceiling lights. She stopped a few feet behind him. He stopped too, but he did not turn around immediately. "How long have you been here?" she said. 11 months. "And you just mopped floors." He turned then. "I needed to see what this place was before I decided what it could become." Marin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that had lost all its sharpness, "I told you to carry my bags for $1. "I remember," he said. "I am sorry." Garrett looked at her. For the first time, he allowed something that was not composure to cross his face. It was not a grin. It was the smallest shift at the corners of his mouth, the kind of expression that only appears when someone decides, very quietly, to forgive. "You did not know," he said. Marin shook her head. "That does not make it okay." He nodded. He did not argue. He did not reassure her. He simply accepted what she said, and in doing so, he gave her something that no rebuttal could have offered: the dignity of being taken seriously. That afternoon, Garrett picked Nolan up from school. The boy came through the gate with a rolled piece of paper in his hand, running the way children run when they have something to show. He climbed into the truck and unrolled it on his lap. He had drawn the building again, the same rectangle, the same 2 stick figures, but this time there was a large yellow sun above the roof, with rays that reached to the edges of the page. "I put a sun on top," he said, "So, it is not dark anymore." Garrett pulled his son close and kissed his forehead. "That is a good addition," he said. 1 week later, Garrett Sinclair formally introduced himself to the tenants and staff of Ridgeline Galleria as the new owner. He held the meeting in the same conference hall, standing in the same spot where he had confronted Derek, wearing a navy suit that fit him in a way that made several people in the room look at each other and wonder how they had ever believed he was anything else. He retained every member of the maintenance team without exception. He raised their wages by 18%. He promoted Ruth Cabrera to Director of Operations and gave her full authority over vendor selection, contract review, and staffing decisions. When he shook her hand in front of the room, Ruth held onto it for an extra second and said nothing, and he nodded once, and that was enough. Marin presented a restructuring plan for the Scottsdale flagship to her board of directors. The plan included a strategic partnership clause with the new ownership of Ridgeline Galleria. The board reviewed the numbers, reviewed the partnership terms, and approved the plan unanimously. The flagship stayed open. On a morning 4 weeks after the conference room, Garrett walked through the ground floor atrium. He was wearing a pressed shirt, no uniform. The mop cart was gone. The toolbox was gone. The gray that had defined him for 11 months had been replaced by something quieter and harder. To name not wealth, not authority, but the calm of a man who no longer needed to hide. Marin stepped out of the Ashford Lux entrance, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She held one out to him, and there was nothing performative in the gesture. No audience, no apology embedded in it, just a cup of coffee offered by one person to another in the early light. He took it. They stood side by side near the south fountain, looking out across the wide stone floor where he had once pushed a cart and she had once held out $1, and neither of them spoke. The fountain hummed. The morning light came through the glass ceiling in long, warm columns. Neither of them had been looking for anything that morning. But some doors do not open because you reach for the handle they open, because you finally stop pretending they are not there.